Lads, do you enjoy getting traumatised on a weekly basis? Well, neither does my co-host Neil.
People call me a victim more than a co-host.
Anyway, welcome to the Mortal Musings podcast. I'm your host, Megan. Each week, we dive into some truly dark and disturbing cases. Do you ever find yourself listening to these horrific tales and saying to yourself,
Huh? No. Huh? What the actual Why? Why did he do that? Solved it, mate. There's no need for that. They're just acting the
Our episodes include cases of serial killers, the story of a socialite that was held captive for 25 years, prison riots, wrongful executions, and scandals in the death industry. At the end of each episode, we throw in a tale of oddity. Anything from medical mishaps to the real-life Weekend at Bernie's or Mike the Headless Chicken. New episodes every Wednesday. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
And remember, here at the Mortal Musings podcast, we like to take the cases seriously, but not ourselves.
Hello listeners, I'm Casey, host of the Cult Vault podcast, and as you may already know, I've been on hiatus from recording new interviews while I undertake a master's degree in the psychology of coercive control. This course is ending on September the 20th, right before the weekend of CRIMECON UK. CRIMECON UK, the world's leading true crime event, which is partnered with the expert-led documentary and series channel True Crime, is back in London on the 21st and 22nd of September for a weekend of panels, experiences and networking. If you're interested in the discovery, education and advocacy surrounding true crime, then this is the event for you. It's filled to the brim with expert speakers from all areas of true crime, amazing podcasters and content creators, immersive experiences, book signings, and even a chance to hang out with the canine unit of good doggies. This is a weekend that you won't want to miss. I'll be at the event throughout the entire weekend, celebrating the end of my masters and chatting all about cults and coercive control. With more ticket options this year than ever before, there is a package suitable for everyone interested in this event. For more information on how you can be at London's CRIMECON UK in September 2024, visit crimecon.co.uk or follow the link in the episode description. You can use the code CULT, C-U-L-T, at the checkout and get 10% off your tickets. And I really hope to see some of you there. Until then, I'm busy putting my calendar together of new interviews, which I hope to start releasing in October 2024. Thank you so much for listeners old and new for sticking with me during this quiet period. I can't wait to bring you new content in the autumn of this year. Hello everybody, my name is Casey, host of the Cult Vault podcast, and welcome to this year's CRIMECON UK. What has already proven to be an unforgettable weekend with the awards yesterday will no doubt continue to offer once-in-a-lifetime experiences. I hope this will be one of them. Insight and education into the world of true crime. Thank you to every person who has been involved in making this event possible, and a massive thank you to Nancy and her team for having us back here again to participate in the UK's biggest true crime event. If some of you have tuned into the Cult Vault podcast, have listened in to some of our esteemed guests' work, or attended this talk last year with Elgin Strait, you will know that as well as covering the subject of cults, the Cult Vault podcast looks at advocacy for survivors and victims of cults, as well as activism, education, and prevention against cults. We also look at the subject of coercive control and authoritarianism in everyday society. If you are here today about one person's journey in and out of a cult, you will hear that. And what you will also find is a deeper understanding of cults and coercive control, in the hopes that with each conversation, like the one that we aim to have today, we can help to educate the wider public and change the misconceptions of those inside cults. But enough about our mission. It is my absolute honour and privilege to introduce today's speaker, Mr. John Atack.
Thank you very much.
So I'm not sure we can do this in a very short and summarised way, but would you please introduce yourself to the listeners?
I'm John Atack. When I was 19 years old, my heart was broken and I fell into the Scientology cult. I was a peripheral member, which is to say I never worked for them, was never a live-in member, and I just paid them money and they screwed with my mind. It was a fascinating experience. I realised afterwards when I left and started helping people who were leaving that almost everybody that had been involved in this group had been humiliated and abused, and I wasn't. Because I'm an artist of various kinds, they have a policy of dealing with celebrities. I wasn't earning any money, but I was a painter and a drummer and a writer. So I was always handled with kid gloves. And when it came out, I found out this group had basically 11 members, including the wife of the creator of Scientology, Mary Sue Hubbard, had been sent to prison in the United States after she signed a 200-page confession, a stipulation in evidence, saying that she had been party to kidnapping, false imprisonment, burglary, breaking and entering, bugging, forgery of government credentials, and theft of an enormous mass of government documents. There was a similar case in Canada. There was another one in France. I was startled to find this out. I thought I was involved in a therapy group with sort of spiritual pretensions. That and the sort of increasing harshness of the management in Scientology. The funny thing is I left, having done 25 of the 27 available levels to turn myself into a superhuman, which somehow didn't happen. But when I left, I still absolutely believed. And I left because I believed, because I thought the mother cult had gone wrong. And so I was about 3 months, I set myself at the centre of the UK independent Scientology movement. And during that time, people started giving me stuff about Ron Hubbard, and I realised he was a con artist and a liar. And that began the next part of my process, which was I would go to somebody and say, oh, he claims he was a war hero. He was crippled and blinded at the end of World War II. And yet here in this other place, he says that on the 25th of July, 1945, less than 3 weeks before the war ended, he beat up 3 petty officers in Los Angeles. And the Scientologist, I remember this particular conversation, this woman looked at me and said, well, that's easy enough. He had 2 bodies. And that cognitive dissonance, that where the stronger the evidence you present, the more willing the person is to believe the stupid thing they believe. I became fascinated by that. So I then spent about 7 years finding out how to talk to somebody who's fanatical, how to sit down in a room with somebody. I had one case where the guy had actually finished a Scientology course that morning and was over the moon about what he'd done, and how to do that without being coercive. Without kidnapping anybody, as Mary Sue Hubbard had done, or falsely imprisoning them, as Mary Sue Hubbard had done. How to have the door open, be able to talk to somebody, knowing that if you put 1 foot wrong, if you said one thing wrong, they'd be out of the door. And for about 4 or 5 years in the early 90s, I did that. I talked with people who've been involved. I published what's now Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, which is the only history of the Scientology movement. In fact, I think it may be the only history of any post-Second World War group. That's how much academic interest there is in the thousands of groups out there. Just unbelievable. I also became involved with Russell Miller, who was at the Sunday Times. We did a series of cover pieces about Scientology, and that he had my manuscript, which I hadn't been able to find a publisher for, oddly enough. I got 11 letters from publishers saying, we'd love to publish this, but we wouldn't make any money if we did, because they'll sue us. So, in fact, Neville Spearman, who was the head of Neville Spearman, wrote to me himself, and I had this image of this guy in a Savile Row suit sitting there, age 70 and very debonair, and he'd sold 108,000 copies of The Mind Benders by my friend Cyril Vosper some years before. And then he explained that there wouldn't be any profit in it, and he signed himself off, 70-year-old guy, Savile Row suit, death to the evil cult. So there was a certain amount of feeling there. Russell used my manuscript and built upon it. I was his researcher for 18 months, and he produced a book which I think possibly has the best title of any book ever. It's called Barefaced Messiah. And it remains the biography of Ron Hubbard. As yet, Scientology has not put out a version to compete with it. So I found myself inundated when I left. Hundreds of people came to me. People were contacting me from all over the world. And I'm sort of going, no, I'm a painter. That's what I do for a living. And tens of calls every day. No emails, none of that, thankfully. But lots of people who were evidently highly distressed by their involvement. So whatever the Scientology group says about, how terrible people such as I have the honor of being labeled a suppressive person. And it is, according to Ron Hubbard, my intention is to kill all life. So feel lucky if you get out of the room today. That kind of morphed into, so how did this work? How is it that I know 8 medical doctors in the UK, 3 dentists, 1 NASA physicist, who are all absolutely crazy about Scientology? How did this get into their heads? We all know that people who join cults are weak, vulnerable, unintelligent, stupid. It's pretty obvious, really, looking at me up here. So I'm sort of going, well, how does that work? And so then it was a matter of understanding the psychology, what is being, I think, erroneously called coercive control, because the word coercion means force, intimidation, or threat. None of those 3 things is necessary to exploit somebody and get them to do your bidding, to go against their own better interests. And a part of that is by giving them a different identity, getting them to identify with something outside of themselves. And that can be a good thing. You can identify with a charity and do good work. But you can also identify with your nation, which, when we come to think about it, is imaginary. It's not actually a real thing where 65 million people in Britain all get together and do something other than elect Boris Johnson, but we all make mistakes. It's something we imagine. When I talk to Americans who tell me they're patriotic, I often find that they're only actually patriotic towards their fellow Republicans or Trump supporters. They'd be quite happy to pitch the Democrats into the sea. And I fear that the same is true for the Democrats. I know, it's an equal opportunities situation. So I studied the psychology, the social psychology of what I will call exploitative persuasion. People call it mind control, brainwashing, thought reform. There are all sorts of terms for it, and some of them are really too melodramatic for me to want to use. There are lots of words. If you use the word hypnosis, then everybody knows what it is. And yet it's very rare to meet somebody who actually knows what it is. There are people who can do it, and they don't necessarily know what it is. So if I'm going to talk about that process, I'll talk about guided imagination, which is, according to the Oxford Handbook of Hypnosis, a complete definition of hypnosis. If you can catch somebody's imagination and guide it, then you can direct their behavior to a certain extent. I've gone way beyond what you asked me. Not for the first time.
So as we are here at CRIMECON UK and we're talking about what has been described as a criminal organisation, what has been described as a cult, what is self-labelled as a church and a religion, and which also the state recognises as a church and a religion. Mm-hmm. When we talk about some of the criminality that comes with Scientology, some of you may recognise the term fair game or gang stalking and harassment, and some of the things that come with or consequences of leaving a cult or a high control group. And Scientology is notorious for using these tactics. You have been subjected to some of these tactics.
A little bit. Yeah, I've been followed by private detectives wherever I've travelled in the world. In the US, that was a bit scary because they have guns. My house was broken into twice with nothing taken. For 2 years, there was a guy across the street from me, and he'd hired a room so he could set a camera up to record all the comings and goings at my house. I found this out when, in 1993, the head of Scientology's investigation department defected. She came to see me in a last attempt after 18 months of trying to get at me with all sorts of stupid pranks and, report you to the police at the drop of a hat, and you had the fire brigade call up and say, "We've had a complaint about your house. Would you like us to come round and make sure it's safe?" Just everything and anything. People with placards outside my house. So she came to me, and basically what had happened was that a young woman had decided she wanted to leave. And she'd gone to the Christian bookshop in East Grinstead, where I lived at the time, and said she wanted to leave. And so they called me. And I went along and said, "Oh, it's John Atack." So that wasn't very helpful. And I said, "We need to call the police and get your stuff from the house where you're lodging, Scientologist's house." She said, "We won't need that." I said, "We will need that." I called the police. Police were well aware of these situations. They came along. I went to a neighbour's house. This is 93. This is before cell phones. I went to one of her neighbour's houses to use the phone. And when I looked up, the police car had gone. She told them, "It's fine, you can leave." And another car had pulled up with 4 people in it. And 2 guys got out and stood on the lawn outside the house, one with a tape recorder microphone shaking out in front of him, because I am extraordinarily dangerous, as you can see. And I said to him, as I would say to any of them, "Look, if you change your mind, if you have any problems, just give me a call." And the next day, one of the women who'd gone into the house called me up and said, "You said you'd talk to my husband if he needed. Will you talk to me?" I said, "Yeah, sure." She came around for 3 hours, and she claimed that she was a very low-level Scientologist and she needed to leave and all of this. And we talked for 3 hours. And the next day when she came back, somebody who'd recently left, I brought along, who said, "You're the head of investigation." And she said, "Yes, I am." And she then talked about the terrible lives of her children in Scientology, how one of them had lost all of his teeth as an infant because she'd followed Ron Hubbard's instruction to use barley formula, which is basically, instead of milk of any kind, you give the baby barley syrup, a corn syrup, so a sweetened corn syrup. And this child had lost all of his milk teeth. There were many other things that she told me, but one of them was that there were 5 agents. She had 1 in training, and she had 4 in my life, including the guy who was driving me around, including 2 women. By coincidence, their husbands had MS, and they'd been pushed out of Scientology because Scientology is utterly opposed to anybody who's ill or disabled, sadly. Well, maybe it's a good thing. Actually, if you're ill or disabled, that is a good thing, definitely. And these women both came to me and said, "Look, we've been chucked out." And I spent a year with each of them doing everything I could, to make sure their housing was all right. And then one of them saw an affidavit against me saying that my only intention in standing up against Scientology was because I wanted them to give me £2 million. That was the first time I'd heard that. Would have been nice, £2 million. And the other one, she had a crisis of conscience because one of her friends left Scientology and said, "Oh, I know John Atack, he's all right, actually." And she went, "Oh, for a year, I've been calling him up with questions, and I've been recording the answers to give to the Office of Special Affairs, as it's called in Scientology." So possibly the worst thing was that they put together a booklet about me that was distributed to all of the houses in East Grinstead. And with that, and they set up a rumour campaign. They accused me of being a rapist, of attempted murder, of child molesting, of heroin addiction, and as yet, I don't think as far as I know, I've never been in the same room as any heroin, but there you go. It's very addictive, and of being a drug dealer. And, so this is called fair game. Once you are no longer a Scientologist, you can be declared fair game, which means any Scientologist can do anything they want to you without any punishment of any type. It's also considered criminal in Scientology to report a fellow Scientologist to the police, which I hadn't fully understood as a member. And so it meant that if somebody came round and burned my house down and told Scientology they'd done it, then they wouldn't be reported to the police. They'd actually be patted on the back. So yeah, that's the kind of, and that was, and I was 10 court cases. I was sued in New York. I had cases here. Ultimately, I was bankrupted because I couldn't pay the lawyers. I had no other debts, and I lost my house and all of this kind of thing, all very dramatic.
So fair gaming goes both ways, but of course, a billion-dollar organization that has the power and the influence and the lawyers and the colluding of certain police departments, probably all over the world, means that it really isn't the option to fair game in return as an individual without those resources. Yeah,
there were about 40,000 of them with $2 billion and one of me with £1.50. It was a slightly unfair contest. And yeah, as you say, it just comes down on you. The idea is to silence you. And, I had meetings along the way where one of the offers that was made to me was that they would buy paintings from me for the rest of my life if I'd just been a little quiet, And I do have a tape recording of that, and I was a little rude, I'm afraid to say.
With the various books that you have published, contributed to, there is a more recent one, which I've just finished reading. It's called Opening Our Minds. I would say it's an introduction to coercive control or exploitative persuasion. And it is a great way to understand the different systems that exist in typical society that we might not be aware of, that also can be applied to things like Scientology. Could you please give a little bit more information about Opening Our Minds, which is available at the bookstore for signing?
Available at the bookstore. Then it's going like hotcakes. In fact, leave, go and buy it now. No, hang on. Yes, in 2015, I helped to start the Open Minds Foundation, which is a US tax-exempt charity, and I worked with them for 4 years. During that time, the idea was to, I'd come to this point where I realized that all of these things that I was studying, I studied sales, advertising, terrorism, gangs, human trafficking, pedophile grooming. Wherever I looked, I was seeing the same behaviors. So the way of recruiting somebody, the Al-Qaeda recruiting manual reads virtually the same as the Moonies recruiting manual. And so the thought was, okay, this is happening throughout our society. And I came down to a very simple idea, which is, first we talk about totalitarian or totalist cults that completely control your life. And I started going, well, does it matter if they completely control your life? The idea that they're controlling your life at all seems to me a bad thing. And so I shifted to the word authoritarian, meaning somebody who believes that they are God's gift or even God, him or herself on earth, and they should be followed. They should be listened to. Their will is true. Whatever they say is not an alternative fact, but a real fact, even when disproved. These are authoritarians, and the extreme examples, Mussolini, Hitler, Stalin, Mao Zedong, are extreme examples. I believe that we live in an authoritarian society, that our school system is authoritarian. It is more mildly authoritarian than it was when I went to school and could be flogged for saying something wrong, which did happen a couple of times. A lot less often than it should have done, I imagine, but I wasn't caught always, But I think that there's a shift, because at the other end of the authoritarian spectrum is the person who says, well, I don't know, Tony Blair says it's right, so it must be right, or, some authority says it. And whenever we accept something that we do not understand, whenever we accept somebody else's opinion as truth, we come into this strange place where we no longer have control over ourselves. we've given it up. If we've ever actually acquired it, he was asked, a documentary maker, he just had this long series of questions that he asked, and he said, do you think we have free will? And I'd not really thought about it in those terms, and I said, no, I don't believe we do have free will, but I think we can get it. And that's still my opinion, that we have to be careful, we have to understand how these things are done if we are not to be vulnerable to them. We also have to understand that we are vulnerable, that people who are absolutely sure that they'd never be stupid enough are the easiest picking. They really are. I had a friend who was telling me, I'd never be stupid enough to join a cult. I said, and yet you smoke 20 cigarettes a day.
So this is all in Opening Our Minds?
All of it, except the story about the cigarettes. That's not in there. That's personal, and you're the only people who've heard it.
The really interesting thing for me about Opening Our Minds is that when I first started the podcast, if any of you have listened will know that I just had absolutely nothing in my mind about what is a cult. Maybe I still don't. I don't know. And through my own education, I've come to realize that as John has said, the systems and models that we can recognize in other parts of our society, in other parts of our lives, that we don't think that we are influenced by, they do exist and they are there. But when you think about cults, or you think about coercive control, or you think about authoritarianism, these are scary words that are pejorative, that may seem like too academic, or how do I begin to educate myself and learn about these things? And Opening Our Minds is almost like it's like a beginner's book into the subject. It's friendly, it's easy to read, it's informative. It gives timelines and historical context to things like commercialization as we know it today. Where did it come from? But it's not too much. So I feel like if anybody has an interest in learning more about this subject without having to watch really difficult material in documentaries, in films, exploitative pieces of media that really take advantage of individuals and their vulnerabilities and their stories, Opening Our Minds is a good place to start. And I feel like that was a great sales pitch.
Yeah, that was very good indeed, and I will be giving you a percentage.
Thanks. So it is down in the bookstore, and we will be doing John will be doing some signings, and I will come down with some Cult Vault bookmarks just so I can, profit off of John's work. But I just wanted to ask if anybody in the audience had any questions before we round up today. Yes.
Just wondering, I've heard about some celebrities that got similar kind of psychology, like technology, perhaps. Is any true?
Yeah, there were great many celebrities involved. Tom Cruise, John Travolta, Kirstie Alley was, Chick Corea. And, of course, there are other groups. The Phoenix Brothers, Reverend Joachim grew up in the Children of God. The Williams sisters, the great tennis players, grew up in the Jehovah's Witnesses, as did the Jackson 5. Tina Turner, the now late, great Tina Turner, was a member of a group called Nichiren Shosu, Japanese group.
Orlando Bloom too. Yeah,
Orlando Bloom as well. So, for me, it's a kind of perverse thought. People are going, well, these people are successful, therefore I'll try and do what it is they're doing. But often as not, they were successful and were then recruited. And Scientology actually has only ever produced one person who was meant to have supernatural powers, a man called Ingo Swann, who did remote viewing and came up with Uri Geller, or Uri Geller, as some people call him. I think Uri is much better. Who's a con man who works for Mossad, according to his own more recent admissions. But this guy, Ingo Swann, said he could do this remote viewing. I mean, Derren Brown does it better, but and when challenged, and we did get into a little bit of a firefight on the internet in the 90s, said that actually he had all of these abilities before he got to Scientology. So even then, I don't think he did have any abilities. I think he was full of...
Is that answering the question? Anybody else? Yes?
When you decided to initially leave, were they trying to initially convince you to return? And at what point did that then become to standard harassment and trying to ruin your image?
There were a flood of departures, probably when I left in 1983. There were perhaps 30,000 members around the world. I mean, they claim millions, but it's not true. I've seen the internal figures. And about half of us left. And half of that half just walked and didn't want anything more to do with it. But the rest of us created this independent movement, which persists and is now, I would say that the mother cult is probably down to about 20,000 members now. They've really reduced. But they got people like Nancy Cartwright, the voice of Bart Simpson, who recently said that she's given them $21 million. So they've got plenty of money to harass me, which is, and they are a religion after all, so they should be allowed to burn witches and stone people to death. Come on, so right. What happened was that those few of us, and around the world there were less than 10, who stood up and said, this is dishonest and it's dishonourable. We were attacked, and right from day one. And it was a shameful thing, especially as we were coming away because we thought it was a good thing and wanted to help people. But this kind of, what I didn't know at that time, I thought Hubbard was gone. I left because I thought Hubbard was gone. And in fact, he was very much still there and suffering from dementia, which, so the last 3 years of his life, things got crazier and crazier in the group. And they just became, their current leader, David Miscavige, at that time said that he was going to be tough and ruthless. And tough I can understand. Ruthless, having no mercy, and they're a religion, more like kind of the Aztec religion, where they rip people's hearts out, or the Thuggees, where you strangle people. Different flavors of religion.
Ryan?
Yes. Yes, you mentioned how after you left and started speaking up that there's all these false accusations of you being a rapist, a pedophile, even a heroin addict. I'm curious into wondering, why is there so much passion in going after you, yet, with the celebrities? And recently there was that one from the 70s show.
Danny Masterson.
How he has been charged with rape, but yet there's been a protection and keeping him safe. Now I'm just trying to understand the reasoning that they have so much zeal and gusto to go after you, but yet they keep that guy safe.
Yeah, Danny Masterson has been found guilty on 2 counts and faces 30 years in prison. He'll be sentenced, I think, in August. There is, meanwhile, the Judge Almeida, gave a ruling saying that his attorneys have been passing material to Scientology's attorneys, which is an offence, of course, because this is, it's a criminal case. And what came up in the first trial was declared mistrial, but the second trial, the judge decided to admit evidence about Scientology's attempts to quiet the witnesses. These offences go back to, I think, 2002, the first one. And these women, and there were 4 of them in all who complained, and there may have been others, were told by Scientology, no, you mustn't go to the police, you mustn't do this. So there's now a civil case following that. I think there's something about the protection of reputation. Part of it is that Danny Masterson is rich and celebrated. And so rather than taking a sensible course of action, because they knew he was guilty, they've had these reports for 20 years, they didn't protect these women, and the rapes were horrific. There were drug rapes among them, and very forceful, damaging assaults on these women. Yet Scientology protected them. And it it's that sense of, well, we're protecting our own, we're protecting the people who give us money. Anybody that complains, even people are making perfectly simple, rational criticisms will be attacked. For me, I did this from 1983 to the beginning of 1996, and by that time, I just couldn't take anymore. The year that I lost my court cases, there was a review of the English and Welsh system, whereby the Lord Justice said, it is the case in English justice, he didn't include the Welsh, it is the case in English justice that he with the deepest pockets wins. And finding myself in that situation, what's the point? I don't have any funding. I've had to earn money to do this and live on charity. Why am I doing this with my life? Also, my health had collapsed. My marriage had collapsed. I lost my 5-bedroom house. So I walked away from it. And when I came back in 2013, it was because I'd been talking to some people, and I realized that in this one case, this woman had left Scientology 16 years before, and she was still thinking as a Scientologist. She didn't think of herself as a Scientologist. She didn't use the words they use, but all of her beliefs were still caught within this. And in fact, she asked me a question. An Australian journalist begged me to talk with her. And I kind of went, look, I really don't do this anymore, Steve. And he was just a really nice guy, which among journalists isn't necessarily the case in my experience. But he was a really thoughtful, and so I talked with her, and she said to me, John, is reality really an agreement? Which is one of Hubbard's bizarre notions. We all agree it's there, so it's there. And I said, yes, if you're the hypnotist. But otherwise, no, we are all able to determine our own sense of what the world is and what's happening. And it won't make that much difference thinking it otherwise. The wall and the ceiling will still be there. The next week, when I talked with her, she said, I've used scented laundry conditioner. Now, nobody in this room knows what that means, but I knew what it meant. She'd been in the C organization, the central group of Scientology, and she'd done what is called the hygiene hat, the training in hygiene, where you are told you may not use any scented products, no scented soap, no shampoo, no anything, because Hubbard was scent phobic. So Rajneesh as well, oddly enough, had people sniffing at the door before you could go in to see him, no perfumes, nothing like that. So she, 17 years or whatever after leaving Scientology, had been able to break a rule. And I went, there must be hundreds of thousands of people in the world who are caught in this. I talked with a guy who was 20 years housebound because Hubbard had declared him a suppressive person, and he thought he didn't want to hurt people, so he stayed home. It took one afternoon to sort that out because nobody had given him the information he needed about Hubbard. And a week later, he wrote to me and said, I've got a job. 20 years housebound. So I came back and I thought, I started writing for Tony Ortega's Underground Bunker, which is an incredible source on Scientology. Brilliant journalist, former editor of The Village Voice. And I wrote about how to unpick the thought reform process. That is, I found that when I went to the States and worked with what was then the Cult Awareness Network before Scientology took them over, that people would say to me, look, we deal with 2,000 different groups. We deal with Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, Christian, Jewish, pagan, all sorts of groups. But Scientology is a different thing. It's so much more invasive. Where transcendental meditation has 2 procedures, neither of them very good for you, I would say, in the long run. 2 procedures. Scientology has 2,000. And Hubbard picked up every last trick from little hypnotic books. So you have his library down in East Grinstead, St. Hill. It used to have his books in it. And a friend of mine who was a professor of theology started writing down what the titles were. and he didn't finish, and he went back a few weeks later and they'd cleared the shelves because the books were pulp fiction, science fiction, cheap books about hypnosis, and books about magic and Aleister Crowley, and they were still on display. You know how he did his stuff.
Oh, I just want to make sure I'm not missing anybody. Yes.
What do you think is the he actually make people potentially bond it with?
It's a very good question. It's usually some change of circumstance. I mean, in my case, it was, the girl I'd been living with for 15 months decided she was going to run off with my friends to New Zealand. And that was a little bit alarming for me because I'm very egotistical and people shouldn't do that to me. But it can be just, moving town, getting a new job. First year at university is the most susceptible period because you've got all of that infatuation that comes with being a teenager. You've got all of these new emotions to attach to things. So you are very vulnerable when somebody comes up and goes, "Hey, you're really good looking. You should get into my cult." The other time of great vulnerability is after people retire. So the LaRouches, the followers of Lyndon LaRouche, right-wing political cult, they will look through the obituary columns and they'll call on people who are widowed to get them into the movement and pass over some money. So it's really at moments of transition and change that we're most vulnerable, and perhaps more so when we're distressed and the system or our family or our friends are failing us, that they're not able to deal with how we feel. And frankly, when I was 19, I'm not surprised that nobody could deal with it. But I did talk to a doctor. I did talk to a psychiatrist. I knew I was not a patient. And I talked to an Anglican priest. I said, "What's this Scientology thing?" And all three of them went, "Don't know." Which, considering there'd been a major government report 3 years before that was all over the front pages, is incredible. I feel particularly, I was not a practicing Christian, but that an Anglican minister didn't say, "I'll get back to you. I'll find out." So not having the recognition of what these groups are and feeling that, your normal support systems aren't working, that makes you particularly vulnerable.
Thank you, Kirsty. We've got a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to do this question and then this question, and then we'll all head down to the bookshop, okay? Oh, Elgin, did you have one as well? Okay, yes.
They're all heading down to the bookshop now.
Hi. Planning the first study I think about something to do but speak about being like that. I just wondered, how much do you think he did not the better life in symptoms last night? And I'm not serious or you might. Well, what good?
Are we thinking about David Miscavige, the leader of
Tom Cruise?
Tom Cruise. Oh, sorry. Tom Cruise is, he's kind of embedded. Leah Remini, in her book Troublemaker, talks about going and having going into his kitchen and seeing him going into an 8-year-old screaming fit with his assistant because the cookie dough wasn't ready for him to put the cutter on. So I think Tom Cruise is a person with difficulties. We know he has dyslexia, and it's suggested that he couldn't read and write when he was recruited. But even if we looked at the leader, David Miscavige, he was 13 pretty much when his parents dumped him in it. He was 17 when he started working for Hubbard. He seems to be a hugely malevolent human being, and go on, sue me.
Which they will.
He won't come into court. He won't come into court. He's avoided any court appearance for years because people might ask him questions under oath. But I think that Miscavige is a victim of it. I think Hubbard himself was a victim of it. He was a very sick human being. He very likely had temporal lobe epilepsy, judging by his behavior. He was certainly manic and depressive, paranoid, and always ill, which is one of the amazing things, because he said, well, illness, that's just you thinking the wrong thoughts, isn't it? And yet he was nigh unto death at least once a year from things that had happened to him.
Yes.
My question was just, where do you think Shelley is?
Possibly in Happy Valley, which is where they confine people. This is David Miscavige's wife, who's been, how long has she been missing for now? It's about 10 years. Yeah, and she just was gone. No contact.
Elgin.
I have one comment, one question. As Casey mentioned, I was her guest last year. I grew up in cold duties. Now I don't think another type of conversation, but as a result of that, I've spoken with a lot of people, particularly so-called first generation members, like join and sometimes leave, but virtually all of them, I would say, have the exact same experience that you mentioned of a sort of reach step where, like, okay, we're gonna try and fix what the cult got wrong, and then some of them get stuck in that step, but some of them make it out. And for me, I've started seeing like outlets from the body. It seems pretty common. You see outlets, instances of that, and I think it's people to try to make sense of them and know their lives. So that's my first comment. Second question is, I know that in the U.S., in Florida, there is a legal case played due to work in the sea. How the Ashima pretty
Yes.
Statutes. Do you have any sense of whether that could be possible?
Wow, good question. Great question.
Yeah, like just legally at that point. Well,
it should be. The difficulty is that we're getting into the tort of undue influence, which is usually about wills. It's usually somebody dying and leaving their money to the housekeeper who looked after them for the last week of their life or something. But theoretically, that could be applied. There is a situation with their cruise ship, the Freewinds, that because there are British citizens on board, they actually need to have special papers to be there. You can't be crew on a ship, and they don't have them. And that may open a door. The terrible thing is that we're often dealing with human trafficking. And I'm sure you did too with the Moonies, that people will be moved to another country so that they can't be, rescued, but also they're moved without their will. I've talked with Mike Rinder, probably the most celebrated ex-Scientologist at the moment, who wrote a wonderful book called A Billion Years, and he said he was 6 when his parents got in. He was 18 when he arrived on Hubbard's ship in 1973. And he was there to do a management training course to go back to Sydney and run the organisation. And when he said this, they said, no, we've got your passport. You work here now. Your organisation has swapped you for some courses. And so, that commonplace. I think it will take a civil rights law firm like, say, Lee Day. I worked with them many years ago, who had the Japanese prison of war case and other things. So it will take people who are very determined. The problem is our legal aid system having collapsed utterly under the current administration. You can't get the money to pay the lawyers anymore. And I think that's a terrible thing. There should be some legal fund where, there's a class action. There are a number of victims, but we don't have that.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. This is John Atack. My name is Casey from the Cult Vault podcast. I also just wanted to give a really, really quick shout out to say that John has a YouTube channel, John Atack Family and Friends, that you can go and check out all sorts of amazing interviews with really interesting guests like me. And then you have Elgin Strait's podcast, the Falling Out podcast. And then also Ryan Anthony Hernandez. He has a podcast called The Truth That Heals podcast, and I suggest that you all go and check out everybody's amazing work. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and we will talk to you at the bar, at the book signing, anywhere you can find us. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.